Life inside Pelican Bay Supermax, a true crime documentary. The silence before the storm. The camera pans across the cold gray walls of Pelican Bay State Prison, the most feared Supermax in California. It's quiet, too quiet. Then, without warning, a loud alarm echoes through the concrete hallways. Guards rush with shields, while inmates slam fists on metal doors, screaming and chanting. In the middle of this chaos, a man lies bleeding on the floor of the security housing unit, his life hanging by a thread. This is not just another prison fight. This is Pelican Bay. A place built to break men down, where silence itself feels like punishment and survival is a daily war. But how did things explode into this violent storm? And what really happens inside these walls that the public rarely sees? Let's go back and uncover the story. The birth of a monster prison. Pelican Bay Supermax was built in 1989 in Crescent City, California. The goal? To lock away the state's most dangerous men. Gang leaders, hitmen, lifers who had nothing left to lose, all of them ended up here. From the outside, the prison looks like a fortress dropped in the middle of nowhere. Fog from the Pacific Ocean rolls over its razor wire fences, giving it a ghostly look. Inside, men are locked in small concrete boxes for 22 to 23 hours a day. No windows, no fresh air. Just gray walls and silence. At first, things were under control. Inmates were isolated, gangs separated. But inside these walls, tension brewed like fire under steel. Whispers of alliances. Secret messages passed through drains. Codes tapped on pipes. The silence was a weapon, but it was also the perfect cover for plotting. And then, one morning in the yard, blood stained the concrete for the first time. A gang rivalry erupted. A man collapsed, stabbed with a hidden blade made from a sharpened piece of metal. The first real war of Pelican Bay had begun. The age of the SHU. The security housing unit, known as the SHU, became the heart of Pelican Bay. Imagine living in an 8 by 10-foot cell with no sunlight, no phone calls, no contact visits. You eat alone. You exercise alone. Sometimes you don't hear another human voice for weeks. The SHU was supposed to keep men quiet. Instead, it drove some insane. Inmates pounded on walls, screamed into the void, or cut themselves just to feel something real. Others adapted. They grew colder, sharper, deadlier. But gang leaders found ways to keep control from inside the SHU. They used coded letters, kites hidden in laundry, or even hand signals flashed through narrow food slots. Orders went out. Attacks happened in the yard, in the showers, even in the chow hall. One afternoon, guards opened a cell door for shower time. Within seconds, an inmate launched himself at another, slashing with a razor blade melted into a toothbrush handle. The guards barely stopped it in time. Blood ran down the drains. The SHU wasn't just a prison inside a prison. It was a pressure cooker, and the lid was about to blow. Hunger for power. Life in Pelican Bay wasn't just about surviving the walls. It was about power. The prison became divided by gangs, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and others. Each fought for dominance over drugs, smuggling, and loyalty. Inmates created their own rules, their own justice. If you broke the code, you paid in blood. A simple disrespect could spark violence that spread across the yard like wildfire. Guards tried to shut it down with lockdowns, strip searches, and surprise raids. But every time they tightened the rules, inmates found another way. Inked messages under tattoos. Maps carved into soap bars. Deals whispered during medical runs. Then came the hunger strikes. Inmates refused food for weeks, protesting the long years locked in solitary. Some lost dangerous amounts of weight, collapsing in their cells. The prison faced national attention. Families demanded change. But inside, the strikes only hardened divisions between those who wanted peace and those who wanted war. And one day, during a routine meal delivery, a tray slid through the food slot. A guard didn't notice the thin rope attached. Within seconds, an inmate yanked his arm, pulling him close. A sharpened shank flashed. The guard barely escaped with his life. The war inside Pelican Bay wasn't slowing, it was escalating. Madness in the walls. Some men couldn't handle the SHU. With no sunlight and no human touch, their minds broke apart. They started talking to walls, writing strange symbols on the floor, or screaming all night long. Guards called it the Pelican Bay Madness. Psychologists described it as sensory deprivation. But inmates called it slow death. You were alive, but it felt like you were buried underground. Still, others turned this madness into fuel. They worked out endlessly, push-ups, squats, burpees, hundreds every day. They carved chess pieces out of soap. They memorized law books, fighting their cases from inside the cell. Some even wrote poetry that smuggled its way to the outside world. But violence was never far. One night, an inmate tore apart his mattress, pulling out a metal spring. By morning he had turned it into a weapon. When guards opened the door for breakfast, he charged, stabbing wildly until he was beaten down. The message was clear: Pelican Bay could not break everyone. Some fought back, with madness, with muscle, with blood. When the yard turns red. The prison yard at Pelican Bay was a strange place. It was a small concrete dog run, surrounded by high walls. Inmates got maybe an hour a day here, staring at the sky through metal grates. For some, it was the only time they saw the sun. But it was also where tensions exploded. Rival gangs avoided each other, until one wrong move brought everything crashing down. One hot afternoon, two groups faced each other across the yard. Words were exchanged. Then in an instant fists flew. Hidden blades flashed in the sunlight. Men dropped as blood spattered the concrete. Guards fired warning shots, but the fight kept going. It took shields, tear gas, and rubber bullets to drag the survivors apart. Dozens were injured. Some never walked the same again. And in the aftermath, Pelican Bay locked down completely. No yard. No movement. Total silence. But that silence wasn't peace. It was the sound of men plotting what would come next. Letters in the dark. Even in total isolation, communication found a way. Inmates used fishing lines, long strings of twisted bedsheets or shoelaces pushed under doors, to slide notes between cells. Tiny scraps of paper carried orders, secrets, and coded warnings. Some used mirrors to flash signals across the tier, others whispered through vents, creating a hidden network that stretched through the SHU. Guards tried to intercept, but they were always one step behind. For investigators, decoding these messages became a cat-and-mouse game. They discovered detailed gang rosters, hit lists, and even maps showing who controlled which part of the prison system. Pelican Bay wasn't just housing inmates, it was a headquarters. And then one night, a guard doing rounds spotted something strange: two fishing lines tied together, stretching across the entire block. At the center was a razor blade wrapped in cloth, swinging like a pendulum between cells. It wasn't just a message, it was a weapon being shared. The discovery sent shockwaves through the prison. If inmates could move weapons through solid walls, what couldn't they do? The ghost of solitary. Some men entered Pelican Bay and disappeared into solitary for decades. Their names barely reached the outside world. Families lost touch, friends gave up, but inside those concrete tombs, they still lived day after day. One inmate, known only as the Ghost, had spent more than 20 years in the SHU. He never spoke to guards. He never joined a riot. He simply waited, silent and watchful, writing journals that no one read. Rumors spread about him. Some said he could communicate without words. Others claimed he had memorized every guard's routine, every sound of the prison. He became a legend on the tier, a symbol of how Pelican Bay could erase a man without killing him. But then one morning his silence broke. Guards found his cell covered in writing, thousands of words scratched into the paint with a paperclip. It was a detailed plan describing guard rotations, weak spots in the security system, and escape routes. The Ghost had been watching. The question was he planning to use it? Or was it just the final scream of a man drowning in solitary? The riot that shook Pelican Bay. No matter how tight security got, violence always returned. In 2000, Pelican Bay erupted in one of its deadliest riots. It started small, an argument during a meal line in the chow hall. Words turned into shoves, and within seconds entire tables flipped. Inmates pulled out homemade shanks, swinging wildly. Blood sprayed across the walls as men charged at rival gangs. Guards scrambled, firing tear gas and warning shots, but it wasn't enough. The riot spread into the yard. Dozens of men clashed, a human storm of fists, blades, and screams. Helicopters circled overhead as alarms echoed for miles. By the time order was restored, the chow hall floor was soaked. Stretchers carried bodies out, some never to return. For the state, Pelican Bay had become a nightmare, a prison built for control, now out of control. And for the inmates, the riot was proof. No one was safe, not even inside the so-called most secure prison in California. Minds breaking apart. Pelican Bay wasn't just about physical survival, it was about mental survival. Inmates locked in solitary for years started to unravel. Some refused to eat. Some carved words into their skin. Others began hallucinating, convinced that the walls were whispering. Mental health workers visited cells, but resources were thin. Medications were handed out like candy. For many there was no therapy, no counseling, only silence and pills. But the breaking point came with one inmate, who had once been a promising student before falling into gang life. After years in the SHU, he began smearing his walls with messages written in his own blood. Guards were horrified. The man laughed, claiming the walls were talking back to him. Soon after, he lashed out, attacking a nurse during a routine medical check. The incident forced the prison to place him on suicide watch, but his mind was already gone. Pelican Bay had broken his body, but it was the crushing silence that shattered his mind. Death in the yard. The yard was supposed to be a place for brief relief, a single hour of sun. But in Pelican Bay, even sunlight could turn deadly. On a cold winter morning, 2 inmates were escorted out to separate cages in the yard. The cages stood side by side, divided by chain-link fences. Normally there was no contact. But somehow someone had left the gate latch unsecured. Within seconds, one inmate charged, slamming into the other. A sharpened piece of metal flashed in his hand. The attack was brutal, fast, unstoppable. Guards fired warning shots, but by the time they stormed in, it was too late. One man lay lifeless on the ground, his blood seeping into the cracks of the concrete. The death shook Pelican Bay. Not because it was rare, but because it proved that even with maximum security, nothing was truly secure. Inside these walls, every hour, every minute could be your last. And for those still alive, the question remained, who would be next? The coded war. Pelican Bay was a chessboard, and the pieces were gang soldiers. Even in solitary, leaders managed to run criminal empires. Messages were hidden in legal paperwork, coded in children's drawings, or passed during court hearings. The prison became a silent battlefield. Guards intercepted letters that looked harmless but contained death orders when decoded. A child's sketch of a house turned out to be a map of a yard hit. A random sequence of numbers revealed a target's ID. Despite lockdowns, men continued to move like soldiers under invisible orders. One officer later admitted, "They're playing chess, we're playing checkers." And then one day the coded war turned real. During a routine tier walk, an inmate pulled out a hidden shank and lunged at another through the food slot. The victim fell, screaming as blood pooled under his door. The code had been clear: eliminate him. The price of silence. Inside Pelican Bay, silence wasn't just punishment, it was currency. Inmates who refused to snitch earned respect, while those who broke the code paid with their lives. Some men tried to cut deals with guards, offering information in exchange for favors. But word always got out. Dropouts, those who walked away from gangs, were marked. They were moved to protective custody, but even there, danger followed. One inmate agreed to testify in a gang case. He thought he was safe, locked away in a separate unit. But someone slipped a message through the pipes: he talks, he dies. Days later, as he was escorted to the showers, another inmate rushed him with a sharpened steel rod. The hit was fast, brutal, and final. Silence had won again. And Pelican Bay made sure everyone understood. In here, your voice could cost you your life. Shadows in the infirmary. The prison hospital was supposed to be a place of healing. But at Pelican Bay, even the infirmary turned into a war zone. Sick inmates were chained to gurneys or wheelchairs, their eyes watching each other carefully. Guards thought the infirmary was safe, but to gangs, it was just another battlefield. One day, 2 inmates scheduled for treatment ended up in the same room. No one expected trouble, they were from different units, heavily restrained. But hidden in one man's bandages was a piece of sharpened glass. As nurses turned their backs, he lunged, stabbing the other inmate in the neck before guards could intervene. Blood sprayed across the medical ward. Screams echoed as staff ducked for cover. The infirmary, a place meant to save lives, had become yet another place where lives were lost. The hunger strike rebellion. By the early 2010s, Pelican Bay faced its biggest uprising, not with shanks or fists but with hunger. Thousands of inmates across California joined Pelican Bay's hunger strike, refusing food for weeks. Their demand: end indefinite solitary confinement. Cells grew silent as trays went untouched. Men collapsed from weakness. Some were taken to the infirmary, bones showing through their skin. Outside the walls, families marched, activists shouted, and the media shined a rare light on the hidden world of Pelican Bay. The prison was forced into the spotlight. But inside, the strike also fueled tension. Some inmates broke under pressure, others grew angrier. Guards worried it would spill into violence. And then it did. During a yard release, 2 rival gang members, both weak from fasting, suddenly attacked each other with handmade blades. It wasn't about food anymore. It was about power. Blood dripped onto the concrete as the hunger strike turned into a battlefield. escape dreams and broken chains. Every inmate at Pelican Bay dreamed of freedom, even if it was impossible. Tales of tunnels, disguises, and helicopter rescues floated through the cells like ghost stories. One group even tried. They smuggled tiny pieces of metal, slowly filing through bars in the exercise cages. Over weeks, they crafted chains into makeshift ladders. It was desperate, risky, insane. The night came. A fog rolled over Crescent City, covering the walls. The men made their move. But before they could climb, a guard spotted movement in the mist. Floodlights snapped on, alarms wailed, and within minutes the attempt was crushed. The prisoners were dragged out, bloodied and broken. Their dream of escape ended in chains heavier than before. And yet, the attempt proved something terrifying, that even in the tightest, coldest Supermax, men would risk everything for one taste of freedom. The Whisper Network. Even under constant watch, Pelican Bay inmates built an invisible network. They whispered through vents, flushed coded notes through toilets, and even used Morse code by tapping on pipes. Guards thought solitary kept gangs apart. In reality, it gave them new ways to organize. Information moved faster than anyone imagined. A guard rotation here, a supply delivery there, every detail was mapped and passed across the blocks. Investigators once intercepted a kite, a hidden note, with shocking detail. Names of officers, times they walked, tiers, and even their home addresses. Someone had been collecting intel far beyond the walls. Soon after, a guard leaving work was followed home by unknown men in a car. He escaped, shaken but alive. The message was clear: Pelican Bay's power reached far past its fences. Blood in the showers. The showers were supposed to be routine, shackled inmates taken one by one for a quick rinse. But inside Pelican Bay, even a shower run could turn deadly. One day, 2 inmates from rival gangs were mistakenly placed in adjoining stalls. Guards thought the steel barriers kept them safe. They were wrong. One man had smuggled in a blade taped under his soap tray. As water ran, he lunged sideways, striking through the gap in the barrier. Screams echoed as blood splattered across the tiles. By the time guards stormed in, the victim was on the ground, water running red around the drain. From that day, officers treated every shower like a potential battlefield. And inmates learned that even the smallest mistake could end in death. The art of survival. Not every story in Pelican Bay was about violence. Some were about survival, quiet, clever, and unbroken. One inmate, locked in the SHU for decades, taught himself to draw using only pen, ink, and scrap paper from legal mail. His sketches captured sunsets he hadn't seen in years, faces of people he hadn't touched. His art leaked out through lawyers and ended up in galleries outside. Another memorized law books, filing appeals not just for himself, but for other inmates who couldn't read or write. For some, he became their only hope. But survival wasn't always about hope. One man collected crumbs of bread for months, drying them until he had enough to craft dice for gambling. Another turned plastic spoons into chess pieces. Still, the darkness always returned. One afternoon, an inmate who had spent years building soap carvings snapped. He smashed his creations against the wall, screaming until his voice gave out. Guards rushed in, but it was too late. His mind had broken. The betrayal. Loyalty meant everything in Pelican Bay. But betrayal cut deeper than any blade. One inmate, once a trusted gang lieutenant, decided he had enough. He quietly began feeding information to investigators: names, codes, smuggling routes. 4 months, he lived as a ghost among his own brothers, smiling while secretly writing their downfall. Then one night word got out. His own gang discovered the betrayal. The next morning, when guards opened his food slot, they found a note smeared in red: "Traitors don't eat with the living." Minutes later, the man was found in his cell, beaten beyond recognition. No weapon, no intruder. Just silence. No one ever admitted how it happened. But everyone in Pelican Bay understood. The prison itself had ways of punishing betrayal. Fire in the hole. Pelican Bay was designed to be fireproof. Concrete walls, steel doors, nothing flammable. But inmates found a way. Using scraps of paper, melted plastic, and hidden matches, they started small blazes in their cells. Sometimes it was a protest, other times a distraction for a bigger plan. One night, smoke filled a tier. Guards rushed in, thinking it was another minor protest. But this fire was different. It spread fast, licking across bedding and clothes. The heat was suffocating, alarms blaring as inmates screamed from behind their doors. As sprinklers rained down, one man used the chaos to attack through his food slot, stabbing a guard with a sharpened piece of wire. It was planned all along. The fire was just the bait. By dawn, the flames were out, but the prison was left scarred, Walls blackened, guards shaken, and inmates even bolder. The cell extraction. When an inmate refused orders, guards used a tactic called a cell extraction. It was supposed to be controlled, professional, and quick. But inside Pelican Bay nothing was ever simple. A 5-man team in riot gear lined up, shields raised, batons ready. The order was given. They rushed the cell. The inmate had barricaded himself with torn sheets, water flooding the floor. He screamed, swinging a metal rod he had pulled from his bunk. The fight was chaos. Pepper spray filled the air, fists slammed against shields, and bodies crashed against concrete. When it was over, the inmate lay on the ground, bloodied but alive. The guards were shaken, bruised, one with a broken arm. But the message was clear. In Pelican Bay, even taking one man out of a cell could explode into war. The smuggler's path. Contraband was lifeblood in Pelican Bay. Cigarettes, drugs, cell phones, even tiny luxuries like candy were worth gold. Despite high security, items slipped in. Lawyers' folders, corrupt guards, even drones dropping packages near the yard. Each object became a weapon or a bargaining chip. One smuggling route was discovered when officers noticed a bird's nest on the razor wire. Hidden inside were tiny packages wrapped in plastic. Someone on the outside had trained pigeons to carry contraband over the walls. The discovery stunned officials. But before they could stop it, a pigeon flew in with one last drop, this time a blade. It was passed to an inmate during yard release, and within minutes he used it to slash a rival across the face. The smuggler's path had turned into a blood trail. The cold winter lockdown. Pelican Bay sits on California's northern coast, where winters are harsh, foggy, and cold. During one winter lockdown, inmates were trapped in their cells for weeks. No yard, no showers, no sunlight. Just freezing air and endless silence. The cold seeped into bones. Breath turned into mist inside cells. Some men wrapped themselves in thin blankets, others shivered until their teeth cracked. Tempers flared. Fights broke out between cellmates, smashing fists against steel and walls. The guards barely kept order. Then one night the silence broke with screams. An inmate had strangled his cellmate using a strip torn from a mattress cover. The body was left slumped by the toilet until morning. The cold winter hadn't just frozen bodies. It had frozen sanity, and turned survival into murder. The puppet masters. Many believed Pelican Bay isolated gang leaders. But in truth they pulled strings from inside. Orders went out to other prisons, county jails, even streets hundreds of miles away. Murders were carried out on the outside, planned from cells inside the SHU. Investigators found coded letters leading to killings in Los Angeles, robberies in San Francisco, and drug trades reaching across the border. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison, it was a headquarters of crime. One shocking case revealed that a hit on a rival gang member in another prison was ordered directly from Pelican Bay's SHU. The message was traced, decoded, and confirmed. By the time authorities figured it out, the target was already dead. The puppet masters proved that Pelican Bay's walls were never the end. They were just the beginning. Blood on the tier. Every tier in Pelican Bay looked the same. Rows of steel doors, concrete floors, and endless silence. But behind those doors lived grudges that could ignite in seconds. During a routine tier walk, guards opened 2 cells by mistake, 2 sworn enemies. The moment they locked eyes, the fight began. One man lunged with a sharpened piece of bone, the other with fists hardened by years of violence. Guards rushed in, but the narrow tier became a killing ground. By the end, both men lay bleeding, the floor painted red. Alarms wailed, but the damage was done. For Pelican Bay it was another day. For the inmates, it was another reminder. The walls might cage their bodies, but the hate inside never stayed locked up. The guards wore. Working at Pelican Bay wasn't just a job, it was survival. Guards walked tiers where every pair of eyes watched them like prey. Some officers hardened, others cracked under the pressure. Whispers spread about guards being green-lighted, targeted by gangs for punishment. Tension was constant. One wrong step, one slip of routine, and it could mean blood. One night, a correctional officer found a note taped under his windshield wiper in the staff parking lot. It read, "We know your family." Panic spread through the staff. If inmates could reach beyond the walls, no one was truly safe. Days later, during a cell search, a guard was ambushed. A sharpened piece of metal slashed across his face before backup swarmed in. The prison shut down, but the war between inmates and guards only grew sharper. The Lifer's Code. Pelican Bay was home to men who would never leave. Lifers sentenced to die behind walls. For them, the prison wasn't a stop. It was the end. Lifers lived by a code: loyalty, silence, and respect. Breaking it meant certain death. They organized yard councils, making decisions that controlled food trades, protection, and punishments. Some lifers spent their time mentoring younger inmates, teaching them how to survive. Others used their power to fuel more violence. To many, lifers were the real rulers of Pelican Bay. But when one lifer broke the code by cooperating with investigators, his fate was sealed. On a foggy morning, his body was found in the shower area, lifeless. No cameras caught the act. No witnesses spoke. The code had been enforced, the way it always was. Shadows of the past. Many inmates carried the ghosts of their past crimes. But inside Pelican Bay, those ghosts never left. Some men replayed their worst moments in their heads. Murders, robberies, betrayals. Locked in silence, the memories became louder than reality. For some, it drove them to madness. One inmate, who had been in for decades, began scratching names onto his wall, names of every victim he had ever known. When guards discovered it, there were dozens, each carved deep into concrete. Days later, he was found collapsed, his arms sliced open, blood spelling one last name on the floor. His ghost had caught up to him. Storm over Pelican Bay. Nature itself seemed to mirror the violence inside. Storms from the Pacific pounded Crescent City, rattling the prison walls, shaking the razor wire. During one blackout, the lights went out across the prison. For several minutes, Pelican Bay went completely dark. Inmates banged on doors, shouted, and used the cover to plot chaos. When the emergency lights flickered back on, guards discovered a fight had broken out on a tier. Two inmates, seizing the moment, had attacked each other with hidden shanks. Blood painted the floor before officers regained control. The storm outside had passed, but inside the storm never ended. Death row without the title. Pelican Bay was not officially a death row prison. But for many it became exactly that. Men sentenced to life without parole often died inside, their stories ending in silence. Some collapsed from illness, others from violence. A few simply stopped eating, fading away in their cells. One inmate, after 30 years in solitary, died sitting upright at his steel desk, pen still in hand. Guards found him cold, his final note unfinished. Another was wheeled out after years of begging for medical treatment. His body failed before his case ever reached an appeal. For these men, Pelican Bay was their last address. Their tomb wasn't underground, it was made of concrete, steel, and endless silence. The informant's last breath. Every prison has informants, and Pelican Bay was no different. Some traded secrets for protection, others for a chance at a reduced sentence. But in Pelican Bay, being labeled a snitch was like signing your own death certificate. One inmate, desperate to escape gang life, began feeding guards intel about contraband routes. He thought he was safe in a protective cell. But word travels fast, even in concrete silence. One morning, guards found him slumped on his bunk, eyes wide open. No signs of forced entry, no visible wounds. Only a strip of sheet tied around his neck, as if someone had reached through the food slot and pulled tight. Whether it was suicide or murder, no one dared to say. But every inmate knew the truth. In Pelican Bay, informants don't last long. The riot in the yard cages. Pelican Bay's yard was more like a kennel. Tiny cages where inmates exercised one by one. But even cages couldn't stop violence. On a hot afternoon, two cages were placed side by side. At first, the men paced silently, eyes locked. Then, in an instant, one reached through the chain link, stabbing with a sharpened piece of wire hidden in his waistband. Blood sprayed across the cage floor as guards screamed commands. Tear gas filled the yard. Inmates in nearby cages cheered, pounding their fists on steel. The man collapsed, body twitching as the sun blazed overhead. The cages were supposed to keep men safe. Instead, they became arenas for death. Echoes in the walls. The SHU at Pelican Bay was designed for silence, but silence often plays tricks. Inmates claimed they heard voices, whispers through the vents, footsteps that never came, even cries from men long gone. One inmate wrote page after page about a shadowy figure he swore visited his cell each night. Guards dismissed it as madness. But others admitted the tears sometimes felt haunted, as if the walls themselves remembered every scream, every blow, every death. Late one night, an officer making rounds heard a banging noise. He followed it to a cell, but it was empty. The inmate had died there weeks earlier. The banging continued, echoing down the concrete hall. Whether ghost or mind trick, no one could say. But Pelican Bay was full of echoes, and not all belonged to the living. The Assassin's Pact. Rival gangs were sworn enemies, but inside Pelican Bay, alliances formed when convenient. Once two leaders, men who would normally kill on sight, shook hands through food slots, sealing a deadly pact. Their plan? Eliminate a third group standing in their way. Orders went out through kites, coded letters, even legal mail. Soldiers prepared in silence, hiding blades in shoes, soap, and mattresses. The attack came fast. During a yard release, members of both gangs struck together, turning on their shared enemy. The target group was outnumbered, overwhelmed, cut down before guards could react. By the time the alarm ended, the pact had succeeded. Blood covered the concrete. The rival group was crushed. And for once, Pelican Bay's enemies had become allies, if only for a day. The flooded tier. Water was one of the few tools inmates had against guards. Some flooded their cells by clogging toilets, sending water rushing down the tier like a river. It ruined equipment, soaked paperwork, and made guards wade through filth. But one flood went too far. An inmate stuffed every drain, turned on every tap, and broke his sink until water gushed non-stop. Within hours, the tier was ankle-deep in water, electricity sparking dangerously overhead. As guards struggled to shut it off, the inmate attacked, rushing the open door with a sharpened steel spring. He stabbed wildly before being tackled to the ground. The tier was left soaked, the walls stained, and the message clear. In Pelican Bay, even water could be turned into a weapon. The Library of Shadows. Pelican Bay had a small legal library, where inmates could study cases and prepare appeals. On the surface, it looked harmless, rows of law books, desks, and silence. But behind those pages, another war was brewing. Inmates passed coded notes inside book spines, hiding orders between legal briefs. Some wrote invisible messages with lemon juice, revealed only with heat. Guards searched often, but the books themselves became weapons, pages sharpened into blades, covers hollowed to stash contraband. One day during library time, two men cornered another inmate between shelves. In seconds, sharpened paper edges slashed across his face, leaving scars that would never fade. The library, meant to be a place of learning, had become another battlefield of Pelican Bay. The death game. Boredom and solitary drove men to strange extremes. Some invented workouts, others carved art, but a few created games with deadly consequences. One game was a test of loyalty. Two men in adjoining cells would press sharpened objects through the food slots, stabbing at each other's arms until one quit. The winner earned respect. The loser bled in silence. Guards discovered this after finding streaks of blood across the tier floor, dripping from food slots. When confronted, the inmates refused to speak. Days later, one participant was found dead, his arm shredded beyond saving. The death wasn't seen as murder. It was seen as a game played to its end. The corrupt hand. Not all the danger came from inmates. Some came from inside the system. Over the years, a few guards were caught smuggling contraband, delivering notes, or even protecting certain gangs. Money was the reason. Power was another. One officer was discovered carrying cell phone parts in his lunchbox. Another slipped in heroin inside soda cans. When caught, both lost everything, but the damage was done. The worst case came when a guard was accused of tipping off a gang about a rival's transfer. The rival was murdered within days. Whether the guard intended it or not, his hands were stained with blood. Pelican Bay wasn't just inmates versus guards, it was corruption feeding chaos from both sides. The wall of silence. Inside Pelican Bay, asking questions was dangerous. Guards often learned little about what really happened. Inmates refused to talk, and even witnesses turned away. When a man was found dead in his cell, beaten and strangled, no one spoke. Not his neighbors, not the tier above, not even the ones who likely saw it all. To break the silence meant breaking the code, and breaking the code meant death. The case was marked unsolved, but everyone knew the truth. Silence had won again. And then, days later, graffiti appeared scratched into the shower wall. Snitches sleep with ghosts. The riot of smoke and steel. The most feared moments in Pelican Bay were riots. They began without warning, turning ordinary days into bloodbaths. In one of the deadliest, smoke bombs filled the chow hall after an inmate set fire to a tray cart. Chaos erupted. Blades flashed, fists swung, and men screamed through the haze. Guards charged in with shields, batons slamming against flesh, but the fog of smoke blinded everyone. When the air cleared, the floor was slick with blood. Dozens of inmates were injured, several near death. Guards stood shaken, their armor dented, their faces pale. The riot ended, but the memory of that day lingered like smoke in the lungs. The prison within a prison. By now, Pelican Bay had become more than a facility, it was a prison within a prison. The SHU wasn't just about locking men down. It was about stripping them of identity. Every door looked the same. Every hallway echoed the same silence. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years. For some, their minds cracked. For others, the walls only sharpened their rage. One inmate described it best in a smuggled note. "It's like being buried alive, except you hear your own coffin breathing." The guards discovered that note tucked inside a Bible. The inmate who wrote it was found days later, unresponsive, his body curled in a corner. The prison within a prison had claimed another soul. The blood debt. Gang life in Pelican Bay revolved around debts. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was respect. But once a debt existed, it had to be paid, in blood if nothing else. One inmate borrowed food and favors from another group. He promised repayment but couldn't deliver. Whispers started. Then came warnings scratched into his cell door. Finally came the debt collectors. During yard release he was cornered. 4 men struck, fists and blades flying. Guards fired warning shots, but the beating didn't stop until the man collapsed, broken and bleeding on the ground. The debt had been paid. But inside Pelican Bay, debts never truly ended. The secret tunnels of the mind. Some men dreamed of escape through real tunnels. Others built tunnels in their imagination, burrowing out through fantasy to survive the endless gray walls. One inmate drew elaborate blueprints of tunnels carved beneath the prison. He claimed they already existed, stretching toward the sea. Guards dismissed it as delusion. But when they searched his cell, they found he had been digging into the wall with a spoon, tiny flakes of concrete piled behind his bunk. It was impossible. There was no way he'd ever break through. Yet in his mind the tunnel was real. And in Pelican Bay, the mind was the only place left to run. When guards fall. The weight of Pelican Bay didn't just crush inmates. It crushed officers too. Some broke under the constant tension, walking away from the job. Others grew violent themselves, feeding on the brutality they saw daily. One guard, once respected, snapped during a routine tier walk. He slammed an inmate against the bars, striking him repeatedly while screaming. Cameras caught everything. He was fired within days, his career over. But the darker cases were quieter. Guards drinking heavily after shifts, marriages falling apart, even suicides. Pelican Bay didn't just cage men. It infected everyone who walked its halls. The last daylight. For some inmates, the last thing they ever saw of the outside world was Pelican Bay's cold sky during yard time. After decades in cells, their lives ended not with freedom, but with concrete walls around them. One lifer, sick with cancer, begged for a transfer to die in a hospital near his family. The request was denied. He died in the infirmary, alone, staring at fluorescent lights. Another collapsed during his final yard time. As guards dragged his body away, the sun broke through the fog, a rare beam of light cutting across the concrete. For a brief second, he touched sunlight before being swallowed by shadow forever. Pelican Bay didn't just hold men. It consumed them. Pelican Bay, the place that never lets go. Pelican Bay Supermax was built to control chaos. But instead it became chaos itself. A place where silence can drive men insane, where shadows whisper louder than words, and where every moment might end in blood. For the outside world, it's just another prison on a map. For the men inside, it's the end of the road, their lives carved into concrete, their stories locked away behind steel. Some fought. Some broke. Some disappeared into madness. But all were marked forever by the walls of Pelican Bay. Because in the end, this isn't just a prison. It's a machine that swallows men whole, and never lets them go.